After 13 years of building my wife's father's company, I increased its value to $85 million. At a family dinner, my wife and her father smiled at me and said, "From now on, the company will be run by your wife's new husband." Something inside me broke, but I smiled back. The next morning at work, everything changed. Let me back up. My name is Hale Trenwick, and I used to think I knew what loyalty meant. 13 years ago, I married Kalia, the daughter of Eli Trenwick, who owned a struggling construction and logistics company that was hemorrhaging money faster than a burst pipe. Back then, the company was worth maybe $3 million on a good day, and that was being generous. I came into the family business as an ex-Marine with a degree in engineering and a head for numbers that nobody expected from a guy who looked like he belonged on a construction site. Which, to be fair, I did. I loved the smell of sawdust and concrete, the satisfaction of watching something grow from blueprints to reality. But I also understood spreadsheets, contract law, and how to squeeze profit from projects that other companies would walk away from. The family dinners started out warm enough. Eli would pat me on the back and call me son. Kalia would smile, that perfect smile of hers, the one that made me forget how calculating her eyes could be. We'd sit in their pristine dining room with its cold glass table and modern art that probably cost more than most people's cars and talk about quarterly projections like we were discussing the weather. But tonight's dinner was different. I could feel it the moment I walked through the front door of their suburban mansion. The air felt thicker, charged with something I couldn't quite name. Kalia barely looked at me when I kissed her cheek. Eli was too jovial, his smile too wide. And then there was Soren Valden. Soren had been hanging around for the past 6 months, supposedly as a strategic consultant, handsome in that polished corporate way that made my calloused hands feel obvious. He had the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes and a handshake that lingered just a second too long, like he was measuring you for a coffin. "Hale," Eli said, raising his wine glass as we sat down to dinner. "We need to talk about the future of the company." I should have known then. Should have recognized the tone, the careful way Kalia avoided my eyes, the smug satisfaction radiating from Soren like heat from asphalt. But I was still thinking like family, still believing that 13 years of doubled revenues, expanded territories, and transformed operations meant something. "Sure," I said, cutting into my steak. "What's on your mind?" "Well," Eli continued, his voice taking on that formal cadence he used in board meetings, "Kalia and I have been discussing succession planning. The company has grown beyond what any of us expected, thanks largely to your efforts, of course." Of course. The qualifier that should have been my first warning. "The thing is," Kalia spoke up, her voice steady and cold, "we think it's time for fresh leadership, someone who can take the company into its next phase of growth." I set down my fork and looked at her. Really looked. Her blonde hair was pulled back in that severe style she favored for business meetings. Her blue eyes, which used to warm when they met mine, now held all the emotion of a frozen lake. "Fresh leadership," I repeated slowly. "That's right," Soren said, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down. "The board has agreed that the company needs someone with a more contemporary vision, someone who understands the modern marketplace. The board, the same board I'd presented to monthly for over a decade, the same board that had approved every major decision I'd made, every expansion, every acquisition that had transformed Trenwick Construction and Logistics from a regional player into a powerhouse." "And who did the board have in mind?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand exactly where this conversation was heading. Eli cleared his throat. "Well, that's the thing, son. Kalia has decided to take a more active role in the business, and she's chosen Soren here as her partner, in business and, well, in life." The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest, but I kept my expression neutral. Years of negotiating with contractors and suppliers had taught me how to keep my face blank when someone was trying to screw me over. "Partner in life," I said. "Hail," Kalia said, and for just a moment, something that might have been regret flickered across her features. "I filed for divorce last week. The papers will be served tomorrow, and Soren and I were married yesterday in a private ceremony." The dining room went quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and strong, even as my world collapsed around me. "Congratulations," I said finally. "And the company?" "From now on," Eli said, his voice gaining strength as he delivered what was clearly a rehearsed speech, "the company will be run by your wife's new husband." There it was, 13 years of my life, 13 years of 18-hour days and weekend calls and missed vacations, reduced to a single sentence delivered over dinner like an afterthought. I looked around the table at these three people who had just systematically destroyed my life. Eli, trying to look paternal and regretful. Soren, barely containing his satisfaction. And Kalia, my wife of 13 years, studying her wine glass like it held the secrets of the universe. Something inside me broke in that moment. Not snapped. That would have been too clean, too simple. This was more like a slow crack spreading through glass, the kind that starts small and then spreads until the whole structure becomes unstable. But I smiled back. "Well," I said, raising my own wine glass, "here's to new beginnings." We finished dinner with stilted conversation about the weather and Eli's golf game. I complimented Kalia on the meal, though I could barely taste it. I shook Soren's hand and wished him luck. I hugged Eli and told him I understood his decision. And then I drove home to the apartment I'd been renting since Kalia had started working late so many nights, to the place that had become my refuge without my even realizing I'd needed one. They announced at dinner that my wife's new husband would take my company the next morning. I didn't leave the house. I didn't argue. I opened my laptop, copied every contract I personally negotiated, and scheduled 3 meetings before dawn. Because here's what Eli and Kalia and their new golden boy Soren didn't understand about me. I might look like just another construction worker who got lucky, but I'd spent 13 years learning every single detail of how their company operated. Every contract, every relationship, every legal loophole and financial structure. I'd built their empire, and I'd been very, very careful about how I'd built it. By 8 in the morning, I triggered change of control clauses I had written years earlier, froze 2 credit lines tied to my signature, and redirected vendor exclusivity to a holding I quietly owned. By noon, their cash flow stalled, deliveries stopped, and the board demanded answers I didn't give. The first call came at 6:30 in the morning. I was already dressed and had been awake for 2 hours, working methodically through a checklist I'd never thought I'd need to use. The caller ID showed Kalia's number. "Hail," she said when I answered, her voice tight with stress. "What did you do?" "Good morning to you too," I said, taking a sip of coffee. "How's married life treating you?" "Don't play games with me. Morrison Steel called at 6 this morning. They said their exclusive supply contract was being transferred to some holding company they'd never heard of." "What holding company, Hale?" I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. "Oh, that would be Midwest Industrial Holdings. Nice little company I set up about 5 years ago. You remember when we were expanding into the Chicago market? I mentioned it in my quarterly report." There was silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the wheels turning in her head as she tried to remember the details of a report she'd probably skimmed and filed away. "You can't do this," she said finally. "Actually, I can. You see, when I negotiated that contract with Morrison, I included a clause that allowed for transfer to affiliated companies in the event of ownership changes. Standard stuff, really. I'm surprised Soren didn't catch it in his strategic review. Another silence. Then, Hale, please. We can work this out. We can find a role for you in the new structure. A role, I repeated. How generous. Tell me, what kind of role did you have in mind for the man who built your company from 3 million to 85 million? That's not fair. You didn't build it alone. You're right, I said. I had help. I had a wife who supported me, who understood that sometimes success requires sacrifice. I had a father-in-law who trusted my judgment. I had a family. I let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. But it seems like that family has moved on, so I guess I'll have to move on too. I hung up before she could respond and immediately placed the first of 3 calls I'd scheduled for that morning. Peterson Construction, came the gruff voice of Jake Peterson, one of my oldest contacts in the business. Jake, it's Hale Trenwick. I've got a proposition for you. By the time I finished my calls, I'd redirected 3 major contracts to competitors, activated penalty clauses on 2 others, and transferred exclusive supplier relationships to my holding company, all perfectly legal, all carefully planned years in advance as insurance against exactly this kind of betrayal. The second call came from Eli at 9:15. Son, he said, and I almost laughed at the continued use of the term. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, I said. Just business. Isn't that what you taught me? That business is business, and family is family, and sometimes you have to choose between them? Now hold on. I am holding on, Eli. I'm holding on to every single thing I built over the past 13 years. Every relationship, every contract, every piece of intellectual property that I developed. You want Soren to run your company? Fine. Let's see how good he is at running a company with no suppliers, no major contracts, and no cash flow. You're being unreasonable. Am I? Yesterday I was family. Today I'm unemployed and divorced. Seems to me I'm being extremely reasonable under the circumstances. I hung up on him too. The third call came from Soren himself at 10:45. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message with considerable satisfaction. Hale, this is Soren. Look, I think we got off on the wrong foot here. I know this transition is difficult, but we really need to sit down and discuss the situation like adults. There are legal implications to what you're doing, and I don't think you want to go down that road. Call me back. Legal implications. I almost laughed out loud. Soren had no idea who he was dealing with. I spent the rest of the morning in my apartment, working through my laptop and making calls to lawyers, accountants, and business contacts I'd cultivated over more than a decade in the industry. By noon, I'd accomplished everything on my checklist. The Morrison Steel contract was now exclusively tied to Midwest Industrial Holdings, my shell company. The credit lines that Trenwick Construction used for operating expenses were frozen pending review of the ownership change, a review that required my signature as the original guarantor. The 3 largest active contracts had triggered their change of control clauses, allowing the clients to terminate without penalty if they chose to do so. And they were choosing to do so. Especially after I'd personally called each client to explain that I would no longer be overseeing their projects. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is war. I assumed it was from Soren, though it could have been from Kalia or even Eli. It didn't matter. They were right about one thing. This was war. But it was a war I'd been preparing for without even realizing it, and they were fighting with weapons I'd designed. The fourth call came at 1:30 from Margaret Chen, the chairman of Trenwick Construction's board of directors. Hale, she said, her voice carefully neutral. I understand there have been some developments. Margaret was a sharp woman in her 60s who'd made her fortune in real estate development. She'd been on the board for 8 years and had always been fair in her dealings with me. If anyone was going to give me a straight answer about what the board really thought of this situation, It would be her. That's one way to put it, I said. The board is meeting in emergency session this afternoon. Several of our major stakeholders have expressed concerns about the transition. I imagine they have. Hale, I'm going to ask you directly. Is there any way to resolve this situation amicably? I considered the question seriously. Margaret deserved that much. That depends, I said finally. Are you asking as a board member or as someone who's watched me work for the past 8 years? Both. As a board member, you should know that every action I've taken is completely legal and was planned as part of standard risk management protocols. As someone who's watched me work, you should know that I don't do anything halfway. There was a long pause before Margaret spoke again. I see. And your terms? I don't have terms, Margaret. I have consequences. The board made their decision yesterday without consulting me, despite the fact that I've been the operational heart of this company for 13 years. Now they get to live with the results of that decision. The board wasn't consulted about the management change, Margaret said quietly. We were informed after the fact. That stopped me cold. What do you mean? Eli called an emergency meeting yesterday morning, said there had been a family emergency and that immediate succession planning was necessary. He presented it as a done deal, said you'd already agreed to step aside. I felt that crack in my chest widen a little more. Not only had they betrayed me, they'd lied to the board about it. Made it seem like I was complicit in my own destruction. I see, I said. Hale, if you're willing to come to the board meeting this afternoon. No, I said, cutting her off. The time for board meetings and discussions has passed. Eli made his choice. Kalia made hers. Now I'm making mine. I hung up and stared out the window of my apartment at the city I'd helped build. Construction cranes dotted the skyline, many of them working on projects that bore Trenwick construction signs. Projects I'd negotiated, planned, and overseen. Projects that were about to become very complicated for their new management. My laptop chimed with an email notification. The sender was listed as Legal Department, Trenwick Construction. The subject line read, Cease and desist. Immediate action required. I opened it and read through the formal language demanding that I immediately reverse all actions taken that morning and return all company property and information. It was signed by some law firm I'd never heard of and copied to what looked like half the legal community. I deleted it without responding. Then I opened a new browser window and began researching Soren Valden's background more thoroughly than I'd bothered to do when he'd first appeared on the scene. If he wanted to play legal games, I was going to make sure I knew exactly who I was playing with. What I found was interesting. Very interesting indeed. Kalia countered fast. She filed emergency motions to void my clauses, announced a replacement CEO, and leaked a story painting me as disloyal. She moved the books overnight and promised the board a lifeline I couldn't touch. The story appeared in the local business journal the next morning. The headline read, Trenwick Construction Weathers Transition Crisis. The article painted me as a disgruntled employee who had attempted to sabotage the company after being offered a generous severance package that I had unreasonably rejected. According to the unnamed sources quoted in the piece, I had been increasingly unstable in recent months and had made threats against company leadership when informed of the succession plan. The article went on to describe Soren Valden as a seasoned executive with extensive experience in corporate turnarounds, who had been brought in to modernize operations and improve efficiency. I read the entire article twice, marveling at the creative fiction. Then I called the journalist who'd written it. This is Rebecca Martinez, came the voice on the other end. Ms. Martinez, this is Hale Trenwick. I just read your article about the situation at Trenwick Construction. There was a pause. Mr. Trenwick, I tried to reach you for comment yesterday, but your phone went straight to voicemail. I was busy. Tell me, who were these unnamed sources you quoted? You know I can't reveal my sources. Of course not. But I'm curious about something. Did any of these sources mention that I increased the company's value from 3 million to 85 million over the past 13 years? Or that the generous severance package consisted of being fired at a family dinner with no notice? Another pause, longer this time. Those weren't the details I was given. I'm sure they weren't. Tell me, Rebecca. Can I call you Rebecca? How long have you been covering the business community here? About 3 years. Then you probably remember the Henderson project from 2 years ago. The one that came in 6 months early and 15% under budget. That was my project. What about the expansion into the Chicago market? Also mine. The Morrison Steel exclusive contract that saved the company about $2 million in costs last year? Mine as well. Mr. Trenwick, if you'd like to provide your side of the story, oh, I will. But not to you. You've already printed their version without bothering to verify basic facts. I'll find someone who's interested in actual journalism. I hung up and immediately called Tom Bradley, a reporter for the regional newspaper who'd covered several of our major projects over the years. Tom was old school, the kind of journalist who actually checked his sources and asked follow-up questions. Tom, it's Hale Trenwick. I've got a story for you. While I waited for Tom to drive over for an interview, I turned my attention to the legal motions Kalia had filed. She was moving fast, I had to give her that. Emergency injunctions to freeze my holding company's assets, motions to void the change of control clauses as unconscionable, and demands for immediate return of what she claimed was proprietary company information. The problem with her strategy was that she was fighting the wrong battle. She was trying to use the legal system to undo what I'd done, but everything I'd done was completely legal. The contracts I'd written, the holding company I'd established, the relationships I'd built, all of it was legitimate business practice. What wasn't legitimate was the way the board had been misled about the management change. I spent the afternoon with Tom Bradley, walking him through the timeline of events and providing him with documentation to support every claim I made. Corporate filings showing the company's growth during my tenure. Board meeting minutes that contradicted the narrative Eli had presented. Financial records demonstrating my direct contribution to the company's success. This is quite a story, Tom said as he packed up his recorder. When can I expect a response from the other parties? I imagine you'll hear from them very soon, I said. Probably from their lawyers first. Tom grinned. Even better. Nothing makes a story more interesting than lawyers trying to shut it down. After Tom left, I returned to my research on Soren Valden. What I'd found the day before was just the beginning. Soren had a pattern, it turned out. A very interesting pattern. Over the past 15 years, he'd been involved with 4 different companies in consulting or strategic advisory roles. In each case, he'd arrived just before a major ownership change. In each case, the previous management had been pushed out shortly after his arrival. And in each case, the company had been sold to a larger competitor within 2 years. It was a classic corporate raiding strategy. Identify a successful company with aging leadership, ingratiate yourself with the owners, engineer a management change, then strip the valuable assets and sell the shell to the highest bidder. The most interesting case was a logistics company in Ohio called Hartwell Transport. The parallels to my situation were uncanny. Family-owned business, successful son-in-law pushed out after building the company's value, mysterious consultant who married the daughter and took over operations. Hartwell Transport was sold 18 months later for $60 million. The original family kept 30%. Soren's consulting firm, which happened to be owned by the acquiring company, kept the rest. I was beginning to understand that my situation wasn't personal. It was just business. Very profitable business. My phone rang at 6 o'clock. The caller ID showed Margaret Chen's number. "Hale," she said without preamble. "We need to talk." "I'm listening." "The board met this afternoon. There are some things you need to know." "Such as?" "Eli has been negotiating with Consolidated Industries about a potential acquisition. The preliminary discussions started 6 months ago, right around the time Soren Valden first appeared." Consolidated Industries. one of the largest construction and logistics conglomerates in the Midwest, the kind of company that swallowed smaller competitors and stripped them for parts. Let me guess, I said. Soren has connections to Consolidated. His consulting firm has done work for them in the past. Quite a bit of work, actually. The pieces were falling into place. Soren hadn't just stolen my wife and my job. He'd orchestrated an elaborate scheme to steal my company and sell it to his real employers. What's the board's position? I asked. Officially, we're concerned about the current instability and its impact on company operations. Unofficially, several of us are very unhappy about being misled regarding the management transition. And what do you want from me? We want you to consider coming back, not as an employee, but as a board member, with full voting rights and oversight authority. It was a tempting offer, a chance to return to the company I'd built, to fight Soren and his schemes from the inside, but it was also exactly what they expected me to do, the reasonable response, the mature professional approach. I'd spent 13 years being reasonable and professional. Look where it had gotten me. I appreciate the offer, Margaret, but I'm not interested in board positions. Then what are you interested in? I looked out my window at the city skyline, at the construction cranes and office buildings and infrastructure that represented years of my work, my legacy, built with my own hands and mind and determination. Justice, I said finally. I'm interested in justice. Hale, be careful. Don't let anger make you do something you'll regret. Oh, I'm not angry anymore, Margaret. Anger is hot and impulsive and leads to mistakes. What I am is cold and patient and very, very thorough. I hung up and returned to my laptop. If Soren wanted to play corporate games, I was going to show him what a real player looked like. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. And that meant learning everything there was to know about Consolidated Industries and their acquisition strategy. It was going to be a long night. I answered with proof. I released time-stamped emails showing her affair began before the takeover plan, filed for injunction using her own compliance breaches, and served notices that forced a forensic audit led by regulators she had named herself. The emails were damning. I'd found them buried in the company server backups, messages between Kalaya and Soren dating back 8 months. Not just the obvious romantic content, though there was plenty of that, but detailed discussions about restructuring opportunities and asset optimization and timeline for transition. The most revealing exchange was from 6 months ago. Kalaya. He suspects something. Asked about your background again last night. Soren. Stay calm. We're too close to let him derail this now. Consolidated is committed as long as we can deliver clean ownership transfer. Kalaya. What if he fights it? Soren. He won't. He's too much of a Boy Scout. Besides, by the time he understands what's happening, it'll be too late. Too much of a Boy Scout. I'd show them exactly what kind of Boy Scout I was. I spent 3 days preparing my response. Not the angry, emotional reaction they expected, but a methodical dismantling of their entire strategy. Every piece of evidence carefully documented, every legal filing precisely crafted, every revelation timed for maximum impact. The first shot was fired through Tom Bradley's newspaper article, which ran on Thursday morning with the headline, "The Real Story Behind Trenwick Construction's Management Crisis." Tom had done his homework, interviewing board members, reviewing public filings, and constructing a timeline that made Eli and Kalaya look like either incompetent or dishonest. Possibly both. The article included quotes from Margaret Chen expressing the board's concern about being misled about the circumstances of the management change and raised questions about Soren's background and his connections to Consolidated Industries. But the real bombshell was buried in the 3rd paragraph. Questions have also been raised about potential conflicts of interest, including allegations that the management transition was planned in conjunction with a romantic relationship between the new CEO and the company owner's daughter, who is married to the outgoing executive. I'd given Tom just enough information to point him in the right direction, without violating any privacy laws. The rest he'd figured out on his own through public records and social media research. The second shot came that afternoon, when I filed my own legal motions in response to Kalia's emergency injunctions. Instead of simply defending my actions, I went on the offensive, requesting a full forensic audit of the company's books and communications, citing irregularities in corporate governance and potential breach of fiduciary duty by company officers. The beautiful thing about my filing was that I used Kalia's own compliance procedures against her. 3 years ago, she'd insisted on implementing strict corporate governance standards to protect stakeholder interests. Those same standards now required a full investigation anytime questions were raised about potential conflicts of interest. The third shot was the most personal. I released selected portions of the email correspondence between Kalia and Soren, carefully edited to remove anything that might be considered private, but leaving in all the business-related discussions. The timestamps clearly showed that their affair had begun months before any discussion of management transition, and that the transition itself had been planned as part of a broader strategy involving Consolidated Industries. I didn't leak the emails to the press directly. Instead, I included them as exhibits in my legal filing, which automatically made them part of the public record. It took the local business community about 6 hours to find them and start talking. By Friday morning, my phone was ringing constantly. Reporters, lawyers, board members, business contacts, and competitors all wanted to know what was really happening at Trenwick Construction. I answered some of the calls and ignored others, depending on whether I thought the conversation would advance my objectives. The most interesting call came from David Morrison, the CEO of Morrison Steel. "Hale," he said, "I've been reading about your situation. Hell of a thing." That's one way to put it. "Listen, I want you to know that Morrison Steel stands behind our contracts with Midwest Industrial Holdings. We've worked with you for years, and we know the quality of your operation. Whatever happens with Trenwick Construction, we're committed to our relationship with you." I appreciate that, David. There's something else. I've been hearing rumors about Consolidated Industries sniffing around some of our other clients. Word is, they're looking to consolidate the regional market, buy up the smaller players, and eliminate competition. Interesting. Yeah. And word is, they've got a guy who specializes in identifying acquisition targets and softening them up from the inside. You wouldn't happen to know this guy's name, would you? Funny you should ask. Name's Soren Valden. I smiled for the first time in days. David, I think we should have lunch next week. I've got some ideas you might find interesting. The weekend brought a new development. Kalia called on Saturday morning, her voice tight with stress. "Hale, we need to talk." "Do we? I thought you'd said everything you needed to say at dinner on Monday." "Please, this has gone far enough. The board is asking questions, the press is calling, and our clients are getting nervous. We need to find a way to resolve this." "What did you have in mind?" "Come back. We'll work out a partnership arrangement. You can have operational control, and Soren will handle strategic planning." "And what happens to your marriage?" There was a long pause. "That's separate from business." "Is it? Because, from where I sit, it looks like your marriage was always about business. That's not fair." "Fair?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Kalia, you've been planning this betrayal for months. You married another man while you were still married to me. You lied to the board, you lied to the press, and you tried to steal a company I built with my own hands. And you want to talk to me about fair? I never meant for it to happen this way." "No, you meant for it to happen quietly. You meant for me to just roll over and accept it." "Well, surprise. I'm not that easy to get rid of." "Hale, please. If you keep this up, you're going to destroy the company." "No, Kalia. You destroyed the company the moment you decided to sell it to Consolidated Industries. I'm just making sure everyone knows what really happened." I hung up before she could respond. The final piece of my counterattack came on Monday morning, when the State Business Regulatory Commission announced they were opening a formal investigation into Trenwick Construction's corporate governance practices. The investigation had been triggered by my legal filings, but it would be conducted by regulators that Kalia herself had recommended for appointment during her brief stint on the State Business Advisory Council. The irony was perfect. Kalia's own regulatory contacts would now be investigating her for the very practices she'd once claimed to oppose. By Monday afternoon, Trenwick Construction's stock price had dropped 15%. 3 major clients had suspended their contracts pending resolution of the investigation, and the board had called another emergency meeting. Margaret Chen called me at 5 o'clock. "Well," she said, "you've certainly gotten everyone's attention." That was the idea. The board met this afternoon. Eli has agreed to step down as chairman pending the outcome of the regulatory investigation. Kalia has been placed on administrative leave, and Soren's consulting contract has been suspended. What about the Consolidated Industries deal? Officially, there is no Consolidated Industries deal. Unofficially, it's on indefinite hold while the lawyers sort through this mess. And what does the board want from me now? The same thing we wanted last week. Come back. Help us clean up this situation. The company needs you, Hale. I considered the offer seriously. It would be easy to declare victory and return to the company I'd built, resume my old life, minus the wife who'd betrayed me and the father-in-law who'd enabled her. But easy wasn't what I was after anymore. I'd spent 13 years making things easy for other people, building their wealth, protecting their interests, putting their needs ahead of my own. "Margaret," I said finally, "I appreciate everything the board has done, but I'm not interested in cleaning up other people's messes anymore." "Then what do you want?" "I want what's mine." "Which is?" "Everything." The final cut landed quiet. I exercised a put option on the IP I had parked abroad, pulled the flagship product, and settled vendor suits with my funds, on the condition the brand be reassigned to me. By sunset, the company name stayed. Kalia lost control. I locked the office. She watched from the parking lot. The put option was something I'd set up 4 years ago during our expansion into international markets. At the time, it seemed like simple risk management, a way to protect our intellectual property if political or economic conditions changed. I'd established a subsidiary in Ireland to hold our key patents and trademarks, with options to buy back the IP under certain conditions. One of those conditions was a change in company ownership without my consent. I exercised the option on a Tuesday morning, effectively pulling the rights to our 3 most profitable product lines out from under Trenwick Construction. The legal mechanism was ironclad. I'd written it myself and had it reviewed by 3 different law firms before implementation. Within hours, Trenwick Construction went from being a company with valuable proprietary technology to being a company with empty factories and worthless production contracts. The phone calls started immediately. "You can't do this," Eli said, his voice shaking with rage. "Those patents belong to the company." "No," I said calmly. "Those patents belong to Trenwick International Holdings, which is a separate legal entity, an entity that I happen to control. We'll sue you into the ground." "With what money? Your company just lost 80% of its value. Your legal budget is tied up in the regulatory investigation, and your new CEO is facing potential fraud charges." That last part wasn't entirely true yet, but I had reason to believe it would be soon. My research into Soren's background had turned up some very interesting connections to his previous consulting engagements, connections that suggested a pattern of securities fraud and corporate manipulation. I'd shared that research with the appropriate authorities. The second call came from Soren himself. "Hale, we need to talk." "Do we?" "This has gone far enough. You've made your point. Now let's discuss terms." "I'm listening." "Full reinstatement, operational control, equity stake, whatever you want." "What I want," I said, "is for you to disappear, permanently, from the company, from the city, from my life." "That's not realistic." Sure it is. Pack your bags, dissolve your consulting firm, and find somewhere else to run your little acquisition scam. I hear there are plenty of opportunities in other markets. And if I refuse? Then you'll find out exactly how much evidence I've gathered about your previous business activities. Evidence that I'm sure the SEC would find very interesting. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. You're bluffing, Soren said finally. Am I? Tell me, how well do you think the Hartwell transport deal will hold up under federal scrutiny? What about the Patterson Industries acquisition? Or the Midwest Logistics merger? Another silence, longer this time. What do you want? Soren asked. I want you gone. Today. Clean out your office, terminate your contracts, and get out of town. Do that, and I'll consider keeping my research to myself. And Kalia? Kalia made her choice. Now she gets to live with the consequences. I hung up and immediately called my lawyer to begin the process of settling the vendor lawsuits that had been filed against Trenwick Construction. The settlements were expensive, nearly $3 million of my own money, but they came with a crucial condition. All contracts and business relationships would be transferred to my new company, Midwest Industrial Holdings. By Thursday, I owned the client base, the supplier relationships, and the intellectual property that had made Trenwick Construction successful. The original company was left with nothing but debt, empty buildings, and a tarnished reputation. The final confrontation came on Friday afternoon. I drove to the Trenwick Construction headquarters for the first time in 2 weeks, parking in the spot that had been mine for 13 years. The security guard recognized me and waved me through without question. The office was quieter than I'd ever seen it. Half the staff had been laid off, and the rest were busy updating their resumes. I walked through the corridors I'd once known so well, past conference rooms where I'd negotiated deals and offices where I'd planned projects. Kalia was waiting for me in what used to be my office. She looked older than she had 2 weeks ago, stress lines around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. Hello, Hale, she said. Kalia. I suppose you've come to gloat. No, I said, settling into the chair across from my old desk. I've come to collect something. What? I pulled a thick envelope from my jacket and placed it on the desk between us. Divorce papers. Already signed by me, already approved by the court. All you have to do is sign them. She picked up the envelope and thumbed through the documents inside. These terms are very generous considering the circumstances. You keep the house, your personal assets, and a small settlement. I keep everything related to the business. This company was my family's legacy. No, I said. This company was my life's work. Your family's legacy was a failing construction business that was hemorrhaging money when I married you. I turned it into something valuable, and then you tried to steal it from me. I never meant— Yes, you did. You planned this for months, Kalia. You and Soren and probably your father, too. You thought I was too naive, too trusting, too much of a Boy Scout to fight back. She looked up sharply at the reference to Soren's email. You read our private messages. I read business communications that were stored on company servers. Communications that detailed a conspiracy to defraud me of my life's work. Kalia stared at the divorce papers for a long moment, then picked up a pen and signed them without another word. There's something else, I said, pulling out a second envelope. Keys to the building. As of close of business today, Midwest Industrial Holdings owns the lease on this property. Your company has until Monday to vacate. You can't just throw us out. Actually, I can. The lease was in my name, transferred to my new company as part of the vendor settlements. You're welcome to find new office space, assuming you can afford it. I stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the construction yard behind the building. Equipment that I'd purchased, projects that I'd planned, workers that I'd hired. All of it would be coming with me to my new company. Why? Kalia asked quietly. Why did it have to end this way? I turned back to face her, this woman I'd loved for 13 years, this woman who'd shared my bed and my dreams and my ambitions before deciding to destroy me for profit. You made a choice, I said. You chose money over loyalty. You chose a stranger over your husband. You chose betrayal over honesty. This isn't how I wanted it to end, Kalia. This is how you made it end. I walked to the door, then paused, and looked back one last time. The security system will be changed over the weekend. Don't try to come back after Monday. I left her sitting in my old office, surrounded by the ruins of what had once been her family's company. Outside in the parking lot, I could see Soren loading boxes into his car, apparently taking my advice about leaving town. As I drove away from Trenwick Construction for the last time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or revenge, but a strange kind of peace. For 13 years, I'd built something beautiful and valuable, and then I'd watched the people I trusted most try to steal it from me. But in the end, they'd failed. Not because I was smarter or stronger or more ruthless than they were, but because I'd been more patient. I'd taken the time to understand the rules of the game they wanted to play, and then I'd played it better than they ever could. The company name stayed. Trenwick Construction still existed, at least on paper. But it was an empty shell now, a hollow reminder of what happens when you mistake loyalty for weakness. Kalia had lost control. Soren was gone. Eli was facing regulatory investigation and potential criminal charges. And I was free. Free to build something new, something better, something that belonged entirely to me. Free from the weight of other people's expectations and the burden of undeserved loyalty. As I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building, I could see the sun setting behind the city skyline, painting the construction cranes and office buildings in shades of gold and red. Tomorrow I would start over, with new offices and new projects and new dreams. But tonight, I would simply enjoy the taste of justice, served cold and complete. The war was over. I had won, and they would never see me coming again.